Hello and welcome everybody to another celebrity face reading. My name is Taylor and today we'll be looking at none other than the vile, wicked, infamous Jeffrey Epstein. Now this guy is back in the news once again after 6 years from his unfortunate suicide, and that is because of course, President Trump's very conspicuous cover-up, for lack of a better phrase, of his death and the conspiracy surrounding it. Obviously, there was some sort of blackmail operation going on here. No one knows exactly who's involved, but we're not here to look at that today. We're here to look at the man at the center of it all, Jeffrey Epstein himself, and his face. What his face can tell us about his personality, his motivations, why he did the things that he did, and the one feature on his face that was a surefire sign that he was up to no good that everyone seemed to miss. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. We're going to start off by looking at his phenotype, which is the physical expression of his genetic and ethnic heritage. Now he exhibits a very particular phenotype that I've noticed for a long time and had some trouble identifying. I like to call it the Bear Jew phenotype. You find this pretty much exclusively in Ashkenazi Jews from Central and Eastern Europe originally. Most of the famous ones are American Jews from New York. You can see it in people like Anthony Bourdain, Ron Perlman, Auburn basketball coach Bruce Pearl, Leonard Cohen, or for a female example, Susan Sontag. So what is this phenotype? Why do some Jews have this look? Well, it has to do with where they're from particularly. Again, this is an Ashkenazi Jewish phenotype, not a Jewish phenotype per se. You don't find Moroccan or Yemenite or Isfahan Jews with this look. That is because the main phenotype here is something called pre-Slavic, which is a particular racial element found in the Western Slavic countries, places like Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine primarily. These are the native inhabitants of the region who precede the Slavic people, mixed between Indo-European and early European farmer genetics. And they are marked by these robust features, somewhat taller, and a thick head of dark hair. Now, naturally, Jews being nomads and wanderers, they have a lot of admixture from a lot of other places. So the Bear Jew phenotype has a variable appearance. It is mostly pre-Slavic, like I said, but some can be more Armenoid or Assyrioid, more of that original Middle Eastern Jewish look, like in Leonard Cohen. And if their ancestors came from Germany or a more German-speaking area, they might have more of a Dalo-faded look, which you can see in someone like Ron Perlman, much more robust, very small, deep-set eyes, much more of a German look there. And Jeffrey Epstein fits right into this continuum. He's maybe a little bit more on the Assyrioid, more traditionally Jewish side, but by and large, he shows all those classic pre-Slavic traits that you can see in this very unique and I think interesting type. Definitely a very powerful phenotype. Alright, with his phenotype out of the way, we are going to get into his personality and physiognomy, starting with his side profile, which will tell us about his temperament and inborn traits. As you can see here, he's got a high forehead, a chin that's level with said forehead, and an obtuse angle to his jawline. These are all the signs of the choleric temperament. Now, what does this mean about his personality? Well, the choleric type is defined by having a lot of energy and by thinking, planning, and acting in the long term. They are builders, planners, commanders, very willful and bossy. They can come across somewhat cold and unfeeling at times, but that's mostly because they're just so dedicated to their work. Now, of particular relevance to Mr. Epstein here and the sordid business he found himself involved in, the choleric temperament is the most sexual out of the 4 temperaments. They are the most intensely fixated on raw, physical sexual pleasure and can oftentimes mistake sex for love. This high sex drive is naturally, of course, a side effect of their high energy in general. They need very little sleep, they act very quickly, intensely, but in a very focused manner, and they do not lose energy quickly. They can just keep going and going and going. They have lots of energy. Now, he's not 100% choleric though. As you can see in this image, his side profile is not pure choleric. It doesn't go straight up and down from the forehead to the chin. There is a slight bowing to it. We call this the bow of melancholy. This just means that he has some added sensitivity, nervousness, and creativity and quickness of wit on top of that underlying foundation of choleric. Now, with his temperament out of the way, we will move on to his face shape, which will tell us a little bit about his personality on the whole, the general archetype that he fills. He has a rather rare face shape. He has a long trapezoid face shape. This is the Uranus face shape. It stands for the philosopher archetype. Uranus is an exaggeration or extension of the Saturn face shape, and as such represents an exaggeration and extension of those personality traits that go along with it. So they have all of the traits of the Saturn personality, the accountant archetype, but just increased. So that means that they are extremely time conscious, diligent, meticulous, focused, and highly sexual. The Uranus face shape out of all the face shapes is the most sexual by far. One, it is a naturally choleric face shape. People with a choleric temperament are more likely to have this face shape. So the choleric temperament, already sexual. Then the Saturn face shape is defined by being very sexual and possibly mistaking sex for love. That's a second layer there. The Uranus face shape is an exaggeration of that, so you have a ton of really intense sexual energy going on here. But what differentiates the Uranus from the Saturn and keeps them from being just Saturn on steroids is the fact that they have very wide-spanning ideas. They have a big picture view of the world, and they often have very radical, extreme ideas. Now, a lot of this stuff isn't super well known about Mr. Epstein, but according to some of the scientist contacts he had plans of wanting to build a massive breeding facility with a bunch of women living there in the Arizona desert in custom housing, full-time just breeding an army of superhuman children of his. Obviously very weird, strange, eccentric sort of stuff, but that stems from that Uranus face shape. Now in his youth he had those Uranus elements there, but they were modified by a more triangular, pointed sort of look. This is the Mercury face shape, and it meant that in his youth he was a bit more sensitive, quick-witted, reactive, more on the melancholic side of things than that purely orderly and conquering Uranus personality. The last thing I'm going to add here is that his interface is very, very small compared to his skull as a whole. This means that he was extremely aloof, detached, and stress resistant. He was able to compartmentalize and not be overwhelmed by stress, stimulus, or in his case, I think, guilt. Alright, with his temperament and personality archetype out of the way, now we can start to get into his specific facial features to fill in the minute details of his personality. We're going to start from the top with his eyebrows, which tell us about his decision-making process. They're rather long, which means that he is a very premeditated person. He always had a plan, and he would not jump into things. He wasn't very spontaneous. Very calculated, very meticulous. Now, I think, judging from the pictures that I could find, that they were actually somewhat rounded, which means that his decision-making process was based very much on social consensus and the feelings of others. Now, this doesn't really make sense until you realize that he had lots of connections to intelligence, both domestic, with CIA and whatnot, and foreign, with Mossad and other things. His partner, Ghislaine Maxwell, is the daughter of Robert Maxwell, who is well known as Israel's top Mossad super spy. So those rounded eyebrows might indicate that he was not acting of his own accord, but rather on behalf of some other interest group, either one or a consortium of various interests. However, his eyebrows don't look super rounded because they lie very straight across his brow. This shows stubbornness and persistence. Finally, his eyebrows were quite low set, which means that he was not the most discerning or discriminating person. He made pretty quick snap judgments about people and things, and he was pretty quick to act upon them too, after, of course, thorough planning was taken. Alright, now we're going to move on to his eyes, which will tell us a little bit about his perception and worldview. They're quite small, which means that he was very cynical and untrusting. They were almond-shaped as well, rather than round, which means that he perceived the world through the lens of his intellect. They were very deep-set in addition to that, which means that he was very calculating and withdrawn and always thought before he spoke, planning things out ahead of time. His irises were blue, which means that he was quite detached and independent, didn't feel a strong need for closeness or intimacy. Now, as for his canthal tilt, if you looked at this picture here, you might think that he has a negative canthal tilt, but you have to take into account he has hooded eyes. Those hooded eyes stand for extreme focus and independence, kind of a cold and detached view of other people. If you take those into account and realize that those are giving the false impression of a negative canthal tilt and just look at the eyes themselves, you will realize that he does indeed have a positive canthal tilt, which means that he was very confident, rebellious, and aggressively asserted his own interest at the expense of others, and in this case, at the expense of the rights, dignity, and in some cases even lives of others, unfortunately. Now we're going to look at his ears, which tell us about his relations with other people. They are actually somewhat close set to his skull. This is very interesting because the image that was always painted of him was this independent, freewheeling, eccentric billionaire financier with all these crazy weird ideas who just so happened to want to meet with all these billionaires and politicians and scientists of his own accord. But close set ears like his stand for dependence and conformity, means someone strongly relies on personal relations. If Jeffrey Epstein was who he said he was, he would have had really wide splayed ears that stuck out from his head. Those stand for independence and nonconformity. In addition, the middle third of his ears bulged quite strongly, which means that he was very interested in social and emotional pursuits. His earlobes were also quite large, which shows a strong interest in material pursuits, whether hedonistic or monetary. I think in his case it was probably a little bit of both, or maybe a lot of both. Finally, there's quite a large space between his tragus and his antitragus in his ear, which shows a strong ability and willingness to talk, and a lot of extroversion. Alright, now we're going to look at his nose, which is the pillar of the face, stands for his behavior and disposition on the whole. It's medium in length, which shows a balance between quick action and deep thought and contemplation in his behavior. So he was someone who could both think and plan and ponder ideas, but also had no trouble taking action and implementing his ideas into the world. Although his nose looks somewhat curved and beaked because of his Jewish ancestry, I think that it is actually mostly straight in shape, which means that his disposition was very cool-headed and rational. This is the Greek nose, which stands for that sort of impassionate, logical, cold worldview. The bridge of his nose was very wide, which stands for very intense energy and stamina, and there was no noticeable bump on the bridge of his nose, which means that he was not particularly reactive. Again, not a very sensitive person, able to be aloof and detached from the things he was doing, the crimes he was committing, and able to lock in and fully focus on his work and the job that needed to be done. The tip of his nose was quite downturned, which means that he was quite self-centered. Now, the tip of his nose also seemed somewhat rounded, which is a bit counterintuitive because a round tip of the nose stands for kindness. Was Jeffrey Epstein a kind person, or is face reading wrong? Well, this is where phenotype comes into play, and this is why I talked about his phenotype at the beginning. See, that Bear Jew phenotype I talked about, that pre-Slavic mix that you find in Eastern and Central European Jews, has a very, very bulbous tip of the nose. It almost looks like a fantasy dwarf's nose. Now, when you're assessing someone's physiognomy and the meaning of their features, you have to account for their physiognomic average. That is, you have to compare their features to the average of their racial or ethnic type. So, for example, in Mr. Epstein's case, his nose would be long for an African, but for a European Ashkenazi Jew, it's medium. By the same token, while we might say that the tip of his nose would be round if he exhibited an Arab or Dinaric phenotype, because of his phenotype and that pre-Slavic, very rounded tip of the nose, we can see that his nose is actually not super rounded when compared to people like Bruce Pearl or Ron Perlman or Anthony Bourdain or others of his phenotype. Finally, his nostrils were triangular, which means he had a strong need for control and had a very competitive disposition. Just a quick note on his philtrum, which is that little ridge that runs from the nose to the upper lip. His was very wide, which shows a strong sexual impulse. He put pleasure over principles. No surprise there. Now we're going to look at his mouth, which will tell us about his communication style. His mouth was very wide, which shows that he was very talkative and sociable and had very strong appetites in terms of money, sociability, and of course sex. Now, although his mouth is wide on the whole, there is an asymmetry going on there. The left side of his mouth is a bit shorter than the right side. Now, the left side stands for the genuine inner self, the unconscious self, and the right side stands for the conscious self, the persona or mask that we put on for the world and for our professional life. So this means that while he was naturally somewhat talkative, he put on a much more talkative and sociable persona for his professional life. He had a relatively thin upper lip, again compared to his phenotypic average, which means that he was rather hesitant with expressing what he truly thought and felt to other people. Now, despite what some people have said about his reputation, his upper lip lacks a prominent cupid's bow. It's more of a wide and low arch upper lip. This is the sun upper lip. If it had a stronger cupid's bow, that would mean that he was very warm, seductive, and smooth talking. But that's not the case. His communication style was far more cold, detached, and aloof. This suggests to me that he was not really tricking or luring people into these encounters. People by and large knew what they were getting into, and he most likely used sex very directly to get them into his apartment or onto the island or wherever else. Now, his lower lip was also quite thin as well, which means that he was out of touch with what he really wanted inside. Again, not acting on his own impulses, not pursuing his own desires. It seems like this guy was acting on behalf of other people. While it's hard to find pictures of him open-mouthed smiling, his teeth teeth seem rather pointy in this picture, which shows that he had somewhat aggressive appetites and was pretty hostile to other people. In pretty much all the pictures I can find of him, the corners of his mouth are upturned, which shows natural optimism, both in private and in public. This shows that he was a very smug, confident person. He didn't really feel guilt or shame about what he was doing, and he felt like he was on top of the world. Finally, the corners of his mouth are also very lipless. His lips were way narrower than his mouth was. These long, lipless corners stand for very strong executive leadership capabilities. You see subtler versions of these lipless corners in a lot of CEOs and very wealthy people, and I think for him it was a very powerful asset to have for running his whole operation. The final thing we're going to look at is something that is of particular importance to Mr. Epstein here: the creases on his face. Now, in pretty much all the pictures we can find of him, at least the ones recent enough where he was running his whole operation and hobnobbing with the rich and powerful, we can see that his face was very deeply creased, and each of these creases carry a certain meaning. First off, he has a lot of horizontal creases on his forehead. That shows a lot of intellectual effort having been put in throughout his life. Next, he has strong nasolabial folds, or laugh lines. These show that he was a natural manager and boss. He was used to giving orders and having them be obeyed. Finally, last but certainly not least, we come to the most important feature, in my opinion, on his face: that super deep, super prominent vertical crease in between his eyebrows. Now, when you see a crease in between someone's eyebrows, especially a vertical one like that, that is a worry line, a crease of frustration. That shows some sort of great worry or blockage or frustration in an aspect of somebody's life. Like I said before, the left side of someone's face stands for the internal, the personal, the private, but the right side stands for everything external, professional, and public. His crease is very much on the right side towards that right eyebrow. This means that he had some sort of intense worry or frustration in his professional life. It was very deep, very significant, and very impactful. What was this? Well, obviously, knowing what we know now in hindsight, we know that that worry was the worry of getting caught. So I can set as a rule for physiognomy and for you guys to use going forward: if you ever see someone with a very deep and prominent vertical crease by their right eyebrow, be suspicious. They're hiding something in their professional life. They likely have some sort of illicit or illegal career that is very high stakes and very dangerous. And now that I've identified this, I'm very curious to see if we can find any other celebrities or public figures with a similar crease to this, so we can maybe detect who is up to no good, or maybe even expose them or stop them in their tracks while we can. But with all that being said, that concludes my physiognomy analysis of Jeffrey Epstein. Choleric, Uranus face-shaped philosopher archetype, very strong sex drive, very detached and aloof, premeditated, calculating, but not super self-directed, driven by other outside forces. And of course, like we just said, showing a very obvious mark of guilt, worry, and frustration right in the middle of his forehead. We really should have seen this coming. Make sure to leave a comment below letting me know which celebrity I should do a face reading of next. This video was done in response to a comment by Amalek Spin. Thank you for leaving that comment. If you want to learn more about this topic or get a face reading done for yourself or someone you know, check out my website, prosopainsights.com. You can send me a message there and you can get some free information on physiognomy or schedule a face reading consultation for yourself or a friend. This has been Taylor from Prosopa Insights reminding you to always judge a book by its cover. Thank you for watching.